G'day, my name is Madison Down, and I'll be running through some differences between sim and the real world in terms of driving a supercar. Fortunately, on Monday this week at Winton, I was very lucky to be given the opportunity from Brad Jones and Brad Jones Racing to have a test in one of their Super 3 cars, which was just a bucket list dream come true experience. So, thankfully, I've got a bit of an opportunity to compare both the sim supercar and the real world supercar. I've already had a lot of requests on what those differences were and what the experience was like. So I'm going to go through a virtual racing school style tutorial video on some of those differences and how the day was, I guess, in the car versus what we're all used to on iRacing. So first things first, what amazing racing cars. These things are incredible pieces of machinery. The speed, the precision of the cars, the sound of the cars, just everything about them is truly incredible. And I loved every second in that race car. They were just amazing cars to drive. I guess in the sim, they are equally as fast as what we're used to, just that you don't have that immersion, you don't get that sense of speed, you don't get that incredible sound. So all of those things aren't there, and obviously that greatly impacts the feel of it. And in iRacing, we tend to think of these cars as being quite lazy and quite almost slow compared to what we're used to in the sim. But in the real world, they certainly don't feel like that. They certainly feel very quick and very responsive and a real precision piece of equipment. So that was the first noticeable thing from my point of view. They were everything I expected and more. I guess from a driving point of view, I'll start right from the start. I'll do a bit of an introduction now over the overview of how it felt, but then I'll go through a lap and explain differences with a lap video as well that you may have already seen that onboard lap, but we'll talk away through the lap and just see what the differences were versus the sim. So braking is similar. We talk about trail braking a lot on VRS in the tutorial videos that we do in the, obviously this is on a car of the future, ZB in iRacing. Obviously this is a Super 3 VE Commodore, so it's a Project Blueprint supercar that I drove. So a little bit different there, but obviously very similar cars. So first thing about braking for me was I was very surprised at how much pressure I had to put on the pedal initially. So in iRacing, it seems like you've got to come onto the brake quite smoothly initially, because if you don't, you tend to lock tires quite easily. So either front or rear locking, and you've kind of got to get the car to transfer the weight smoothly and get onto or transfer that load smoothly on the tire to avoid locking them, even in a straight line. Yes, you can get good initial decent initial pressure and decent max pressure, but it doesn't feel as though you can really smash the pedal immediately and get right on it. In the real world, that was totally different. You had to really stand on the brake pedal as hard as you could initially, and the thing just wouldn't feel like it would lock up. And as it turns out, I had more on the table there that I could have even broke harder than where I did. So it's one of those ones where that part of it is different, but the rest of the braking zone is actually similar to iRacing, where you actually brake quite hard in a straight line, fairly consistent brake, and then trail the brake into the apex to get that nose turning into the corner. So from that point of view, it's similar. Obviously, small difference there with the initial brake application being so solid. There's no brake boosters in the cars either, so you've really got to push the brake pedal really hard. I'm not sure, realistically, you hear numbers thrown around this all the time. All I know is that it was much more physical. I used 50 kilos on my HE pedals. I think it was probably more than that I was having to push, and that was in a car with a very light master cylinder by Supercar standards. So, it was close to what I was used to, but I needed to push harder initially in the stop. Once we got to the corner and you had the trail brake, it was very similar to what I was used to. So the only other thing with the braking was I found it was very easy to lock a tyre late in the braking zone. If you carried too much corner speed in and had to trail the brake a little bit too hard, or a little bit too much brake pressure in corner entry to mid, it wanted to lock a front really easily. Probably similar to the sim, but you don't get away with it in the real car it won't slow down anywhere near as quick, and it won't turn pretty much at all with a tyre locked. Whereas in iRacing, you can still turn the car fairly well with a locked tyre. It's not the end of the world. So from that point, getting into the mid-corner phase, very similar. So the way you transfer the weight, getting it on the nose to keep the thing turning, is very similar. In the real world, I found that actually came quite naturally. It's just a matter of getting used to that different muscle memory with the throttle and brake to get the car to react to how I wanted it to get. Obviously, it wasn't perfect in the real world for me, but I think that would come with seat time. But the actual feel of the weight transfer was quite similar to what we're used to in the sim. The throttle feel and response, I felt like the supercar would light the tyres up a fair bit easier in the first 25% of the throttle. It felt like you had a lot more horsepower lower down in the throttle percentage. So in the first couple of laps, I felt as though, and I was lucky, I actually got to drive 2 different cars on the day, but the first car I drove was, I think the throttle mapping was a bit different, and it felt like about 10% throttle was about 50% actual. The second car I drove, which is where I did my quicker lap, it was a little bit lazier on throttle response. It's closer to iRacing, but still it was more responsive than what we are probably used to in the sim. Car felt a lot more grunty at low RPM, and you had to be a lot smoother in that first pickup throttle phase, otherwise it would want to jump into wheel spin quite quickly. So that was a bit of a feature of the real car, that it did feel quite powerful when you first picked the throttle up. But again, that actually just could be an immersion thing as well, and not quite being used to the pedal feel of the car. So, but that was the feeling from the driver's seat for me. The physicality of the car was pretty full on. So I talked about braking and how hard you have to brake. The steering weight was quite solid. I was fairly surprised at how heavy the steering actually was. It was probably a little bit heavier than I expected. So it's nothing that you can't match with a direct drive wheel, but it's certainly, for me, after 5, 6, 7 laps, it was starting to get, if you're not used to it, which I wasn't, it was starting to get a little bit on the heavier side, particularly in the low speed corners in the mid sector at Winton. It was where you had a lot of lock on the wheel. Wheel was pretty much upside down. You started to really feel that through the arms. And the gear shifting as well in the Project Blueprint car with the shift cut, so had to really pull back on the shifter quite hard, and I gotta say, the day after I didn't expect it, but around my arm here definitely was on a little bit of the sore side, so that was surprising. I didn't expect the shifting to be, I knew it was pretty solid, but I didn't expect to actually be a little bit stiff the day after. I've never had that changing gears before, so really cool. So yeah, that point of view, obviously we struggle to match in the sim, that physicality of the cars. It's definitely the most physical race car I've driven. I'd probably position it somewhere quite similar to a go-kart in the way that it feels, in terms of being a little bit stiff the next day. Pretty much every other race car I've been lucky enough to drive, or car to drive on a track, I've never struggled with the physicality of it. So Supercar is on another level from that point of view, but I guess that's what you get when you got a pretty fast race car. So yeah, so I'll jump on to the other computer just behind me here, and we'll have a look at a bit of onboard video, go through it, and just see those things I talked about kind of in motion, and maybe even compare it a little bit to the sim, so that we can talk through those differences. So as I said, I'll do it similar to a tutorial video that we do with VRS, and just try and give a bit of an idea on what differences we've got. But thanks everybody for the interest. It's a lot of people have been very supportive and saying great things. Again, a massive thanks to Brad Jones Racing and Brad Jones directly for giving 3 E-Series drivers an opportunity. I know myself, Jake and Jackson all had an absolute blast at Winton on Monday, and yeah, we enjoyed every second, and the engineers were great too, with Tony Woodward did a lot with us to support us and also prepare us for the day, and also Andrew Edwards as well helped us out substantially across the day and across the E-Series with those guys too, so big thanks to them. I'll jump across to the other sim, and we'll have a look at the lap and do a bit of a comparison. So here we are at Winton in the Brad Jones Racing Super 3 car, viewing the onboard video of the fastest lap that I did on the day, which was a 1:24.63. I was pretty happy with that overall. Don't think I could have got too much more out of the car, but we'll have a look at this. I'll try and compare a lot of what we see here to the sim, and that way a lot of you out there are asking what the differences are, so I'll try and compare those as well as I can. But on this lap in particular, if we start the video, you're going to be braking around about that 100 meter board, and what was really important in the supercar was to brake quite hard initially, basically as hard as you could possibly put your foot on the brake pedal initially to stop the car. The car seemed to have really good grip at that first initial brake application, so you could really stamp on the pedal, and I still had more to give there. I was still losing time when we had a look back at the data in that particular area. So that's very important. You can actually, that initial hit is much more important in the real car than what it is in the sim. In the sim, yes, it's aggressive, but it's easier to lock a tyre in the sim initially. However, what I would say, towards the end of this braking zone into the second last corner, I found it was also more difficult later in the stop. I was getting a little bit of inside front locking, or IFL, and that seemed to come from not slowing the car down enough initially, and then trying to overbrake the car on turn in ever so slightly when I was going a little bit too quick. The other thing that is as important in the sim and when it comes to braking is trailing the brake to the apex. You'll hear me talk about it all the time in the virtual racing school tutorial videos that I do, that trailing that brake right into the apex and keeping that weight across the front of the car is so important. So we'll have a look at this lap here. So braking very hard initially there, and then as soon as you turn the wheel, just here, trailing that brake into the apex of the corner all the way to the middle just there. If you clear the brake too early, it picks the nose up and you begin to get understeer. You don't have enough rotation in the car, and that translates into oversteer out the other side on exit, where you'll be struggling with wheel spin. So commencing the lap, second gear all through these last corners, get it turned on the throttle nice and smoothly out the other side there. A little bit of wheel spin onto the straight quite often, it's pretty hard to manage. Up to into fifth gear there. The car can brake as late as the 100 board. I didn't get the confidence to actually get that deep, but I was braking around about the 125, 130 meters. Again, quite a big brake application down here. So stand pretty hard onto the brake pedal. And basically get that slowing down happening as early as you can into the corner. Very similar style, so braking quite hard, down the gears there, trail the brake into the apex, and you're gonna, well, I was aiming to get half the car across the inside curbing. The car actually handled the curbs quite well. It does in the sim as well. The important thing I found is that you need to fully commit to the curb. Don't half-ass it. Don't just clip the curb. If you're going to use it, actually use it with half the car. So really get up on top of it and get the car to kind of bounce across it in the most smooth way possible. Again, you see that in the sim. The other thing that's important is not to do too much braking or accelerating across the curb, because the car isn't settled. You're going to get wheel spin, you're going to get inside front locking, you're going to get instability, and a few of us on the day found that out in a key part of the track. I'll show you later on. So you get half the car across the curb into turn one. Once it lands, begin to get on the throttle. I didn't hit the one on the right there too much for the reasons stated above, or stated earlier. Don't want to unsettle the car too much in an acceleration zone. So use all the road out the other side there, up to the limit, up to fourth gear, down a gear back to third. So braking around about, so you've got the board there on the left, so braking just after the 100 board. Down the gears, I went down to third. I know others were using second. I found third flowed a bit better. Get it into the camber. I just touched the curb. Ideally, I wouldn't want to touch that. Unsettles the car a little bit, but you got a lot of camber in these corners, so you got to keep the car down in the camber of the corner there. Make sure that you don't run wide. Use all the available road on the exit. There's a new concrete strip and rumble strip. You find your way all the way out there onto those curbs and use all the road there. In this whole section, the car actually felt quite comfortable. As I said, I probably wasn't braking the car hard enough in the big braking zone. So in this section where we didn't have as much of a big initial brake hit, the speed felt pretty good and the technique was probably not too bad.
It was more the big brake applications where I wasn't used to how much you had to actually stop the car initially. Late in the stop wasn't so bad, but initial application. So in the mid sector of Winton where there's not too much braking, I think the technique was a lot closer to the sim in those low speed areas of the circuit, but definitely the big braking zones, you need to brake quite a bit harder initially. A little bit of brake, trail the brake to the apex, pick the throttle up nice and smoothly. Now this is a section of road coming up into here that I found quite a lot of time needed to trust the car a bit more. So initially I was not driving in here hard enough and trying to drive the car on the rear tyre too much. So slow the car down for a kind of a good exit. Reality is in turn 5 you don't really need a good exit, and you've got to drive it in quite deep on the front tyre and almost generate the understeer to keep the car stable enough to get through there fast. So it was a little bit of a hairy experimentation session, I guess, in this particular one, trying to drive it in there faster than what you think the car will stick. But the grip was there. It was really good at high speed. When I actually started doing it, it felt close to the sim. So in the sim, I've found the same characteristics tend to work quite well at the high speed circuits, where you need to try and get the car to lean on the front tyre a fair bit, particularly early in the high speed corner. Keeps the car nice and stable, keeps it on line. Even though this car's got a lot less aero than the cars we're used to in the sim with the ZBs that we all know and love at the moment, it still felt very gripped up in that area. So flat out on turn-in, bit of brake, so a little bit of trail brake into the apex, keep it turning, let it run to about 3/4 track out to the outside, double apex, begin to get back to the throttle. Now this curb here on the right was one of the ones I was speaking about. You can use this curb, but you actually need to make sure that the car's settled. Don't brake or accelerate across this curb too much. So only a little bit of brake application, a little bit of throttle application, and that way the car stays nice and stable across that curb, which is going to result in the car braking efficiently into the first of the M section of Winton, or the cleavage section of Winton. So I actually did have an off down here later in the day, or actually the lap after this one, where I pinched a right front tyre. Basically, I carried more speed here through turn number 5 through the sweeper, and it's going quicker into here. And what I should have actually done is broken at the same spot, but I actually picked the brake up while the car was still on 2 wheels. So as soon as it landed, basically it just locked the front right straight away, and I couldn't get it properly stopped for the next corner and just ran off. So very important to make sure that you, like in the sim, you don't carry too much throttle or too much brake across the curbs while it's on 2 wheels. But it is also important to commit to this curb and make sure you do hit it with a reasonable amount of the car, so it soaks that curb up quite well. The other thing is the amount of throttle and brake that you actually use while hitting the curb matters a lot. So when you hit those curbs, make sure that you have the weight a little bit on the rear of the car. Same in the sim. Have the weight a little bit on the back, little tiny bit of throttle, say 10-15% throttle, and it just helps the front to soak that curb up a bit nicer. So it was a similar technique in this car. Coming down into the M section, second gear, get it turned, trail the brake right to the apex, and then nice and smoothly out the other side on the throttle. Again, same in the middle, hold it tight to the curb, but don't hit it smoothly on the throttle. Trail the brake right to the apex, and then again, drive off as straight as you can, as smoothly on the throttle as you can. So I found that sector was actually the sector I was most comfortable in. No surprises for me there. I've driven Winton before in our Cobra that you might have seen me drive at racetracks, and basically in that sector I've always been quite strong. It's a sector where you need to be really patient, and your pedal inputs make a really big difference. So trailing that brake to the apex of every corner, keeping that weight on the nose, very, very important, and coming out the other side with no wheel spin is also critical. So getting back into the end of the lap here, and again, these next braking zones we've already touched on, but you need to brake quite hard for these initially, and I just wasn't doing that hard enough. So braking just after the 100, down 2 gears, and you can actually slightly hear it. What you used to in the supercar from TV is you'll hear the engine decelerate a little bit more aggressively than how it is for me, so I'm not slowing the car down quite enough. And actually what happens is when I get to this corner, I've actually already cleared the brake pedal at this point, and I'm looking to get back to the throttle. The issue is that I haven't broken late enough so I've cleared the brakes so that I don't lose too much speed. But now I don't have weight on the nose of the car, so now I'm actually picking the throttle up with a lot of lock on the car. So the car doesn't want to do that. You hear throttle reset and struggling to get back to the throttle early enough. So that we talk about that all the time in the sim, is making sure that you get the car turned on the brake in this, especially early in the corner. And that was actually just the muscle memory just wasn't there for me in those few laps just to try and get that right. But it was really cool to see that that was very close to what we talk about and execute in the sim. Same thing in these last corners here, just big brake application, trailing the brake into the apex, drive off quite straight. It was, I guess, the part of it for me, and what was really cool with this test day, and again, it was a massive thanks to Brad Jones Racing for putting 3 sim races into the cars to give us a crack. And I think what I took out of it the most was that the technique of driving a supercar, the basic techniques, you can actually learn in iRacing. So I pretty much drove this car the same way that I would drive the car in iRacing. I was doing all the same things. I was right foot braking instead of left foot braking, which is just a personal choice. I've never found that in the sim I feel comfortable right foot braking, but in real life I feel more comfortable doing so. I can't really explain why. I can actually do both in the sim just as efficiently as the other, but in the sim I prefer left foot, in real life I prefer right. The other thing that I noticed was that I've got the VRS Direct Force Pro steering wheel. The steering wheel output was similar, so the feel I got through the wheel was quite similar to a direct drive wheel. But what I would say is that you feel the steering load up a little bit more in the real car than what you do in the sim, and that's probably just a setting point of view from where I have. I have the VRS wheel on about half percentage, and then around about 30, I think it's 32, 33 Newton meters in the game. And I found my arms and wrists were a lot more sore in the real car. And the area that you really felt it was in the midsection of the track, in and around the cleavage. The car was, if we head back actually and have a look, in this section here, the steering really loaded up in the low speed when it had the camber coming. In that mid part of the corner, it was really loaded. That was the area where I felt the steering probably was the most different to the sim, but in the high speed corners it was quite similar, and you did really have to pull the wheel down into the apexes there to get it turned, but in high speed it was definitely a little bit easier to manage. Braking, I've got the HE Sprint pedals. The braking of these of the real pedals, this car had a fairly soft master cylinder. On the day, I actually drove 2 different cars. So the first one I drove had a much stronger master cylinder. You needed to push it even harder, and it also had a shorter throw on the pedal, so it was very solid. This one had a little bit softer master cylinder and a longer brake throw, which was actually closer to how I have my HE Sprint set up. So it was probably more comfortable in this car for me. As I think I touched on that earlier on as well, but basically, the feel of the brake was actually quite similar. It was more just what you needed to get out of it. So the actual how much brake pressure you can get initially, that initial hit was just so much higher than what I had previously been used to with the sim. So you could very easily learn that. The technique is similar to the sim with the trail braking to the apex, but that initial application does need to be larger. Obviously, no paddles in a supercar, not at this stage anyway. So the old sequential shift dog box setup. I actually had a sore arm the next day, which was surprising. So it felt you had to pull on the shifter reasonably hard to get the car to get in gear. It wasn't crazy, it was manageable, but it was a lot more solid than any sim shifter I've ever felt. If you didn't pull hard enough on it, it just wouldn't take the gear. So you needed to pull hard enough to get it to kind of activate. The next day when I was back at work, I did definitely have a sore arm. So definitely a little bit more solid and mechanical than what the sim is. The overall feel in the cockpit actually felt really similar. Like, I use virtual reality, different car, but if you drive the Project Blueprint car in iRacing back to back, which I did, the cockpit feel and overall feel of the car is very similar to that. So I thought that was really cool. I didn't jump in the car and it didn't feel alien. Like, I've got a very similar wheel rim to this on my sim, so it all felt very natural. So yeah, from that point of view, the car was really, really natural to jump into. More natural than what I was expecting, which was really, really cool. So it shows how good of a job that iRacing's done with the basics. What I guess people are going to ask, yeah, the iRacing car's not perfect. It's not. It's got its differences. I guess what I wanted to say out of this mostly was the iRacing car, despite its differences, does give you a good understanding of how to get the car around the track in a very similar technique to real life. There are differences, and those differences are the 1%ers. They're going to be the differences between winning and losing, and it's no different than the real cars. You can drive it around reasonably quickly, but you're not about to go beat Scott McLaughlin and Jamie Whincup first time out, because they've so much more across those 1%ers than what someone jumping in having barely driven the cars is. And you see that all the time with people coming up from Super 2 and Super 3 or endurance co-drivers when the internationals come across. They can get the car around the track pretty well, but it's those 1%ers that really take you that extra half a second to a second further. But I'll give you guys a watch of this video. I'll try commentate it without pausing so you get an understanding of what it looks like. So hard on the brakes into the last corner, down to second gear, trail that brake to the apex, pick the throttle up nice and smoothly through the other side. Again, trail brake it in, try not to hit the inside curb. A little bit of wheel spin coming onto the straight, just snag the rev limiter there as well. Up to fifth gear and braking it around about the 130 metre board, just about 130 metres on the right hand side, down to third gear, a little bit of inside curb. Try to stay off this one a little bit there, use all the exit road, pick the throttle up nice and smoothly is the key. Down to third gear, trail the brake to the apex. Don't use too much inside curb, but use all of the outside curb. This one here, you can use a little bit of the inside curb, but not too much. Again, all the outside curb used. Into the sweeper and drive in as late as you can. Probably can get in there a bit deeper than that. Double apex, little moment through the middle, not ideal. Carry a bit of curb. Don't brake until the car hits the ground. Trail the brake into the apex of these slow M corners and through the middle, keep it nice and low to the curve, as low as you can without hitting it. This last one you want to drive off fairly straight, try and use it like a drag strip basically, get nice equal load on those rear tyres. Up towards turn number 10 and hard on the brakes, trail the brake into the apex, get it rotated, don't use the inside curb, but try to get back to the throttle as early as you can there when the wheel is straight. Down into the last corner and braking around about the 100 board, down the gears, hard on the brakes, down to second gear, stay off the inside curb, use all the road there on the left hand side. Again, stay off the inside curb in the last corner, but use all of that outside curb that's there to be used. So that is a lap of Winton Motor Raceway in the Brad Jones Racing Super 3 car number 8. Lap time, as I said, was a 1:24. So big thanks once again to Brad Jones Racing, Brad Jones, Tony Woodward, and Andrew Edwards on their help on the day and the opportunity in general. We all appreciated it enormously. So massive thanks to everybody at BJR for the opportunity. Hopefully I gave a little bit of insight into the differences. It's kind of hard to explain because it's probably not as different as what some people would say. But hopefully it gives some insight. If you got any questions, please comment. Let me know. Ask me a question directly if you want, if you don't want to ask it in public. But I'll try and answer what I can within reason. Not exactly an expert, but at the same time, happy to try and give some insight between the two. Thanks, everybody.